Hello there and welcome back to Laurence Plays Factorio Planetary Pioneers. And in this video, because we've completed a number of planets for certain levels of completion, I thought it'd be quite nice to pick everyone else's brains on how they feel that things are going with the different planets, what they were enjoying about the game, what they think works, what they think doesn't work, all that sort of thing. And then a couple of other questions besides. So first up, Mike has commented that he's been a bit surprised at how small scale some of the planets seem to be. And I sort of know what he means. We managed to complete Lignumis in one stream, and to be fair, Lignumis we were considering to be very much a starter planet, a sort of a gentle introduction to the game, and then we have had to come back to it a couple of times since, so it's been a little bit deeper than it initially appeared. But there wasn't a huge amount on this planet, so we built up the wooden science, we built up the steam science, we did some research here, then we skedaddled in our wooden rockets and dropped down to Norvis and carried on from there. There wasn't really a huge amount that went into that. Then we went off to Maluna, and okay, there were a few more things to be done over here. It was a slightly more involved planet, and we spent quite a lot more time here. But a lot of that time we spent here was because we're having headaches with the wood production and shortages of belts. The actual production of the systems wasn't too difficult, and making the science pack that's made on this planet was absolutely trivial. All the bits and pieces required for it come straight out of the asteroid chunk processing. So the ice comes straight out of crushing the oxide asteroids. We get iron ore, which we can cook into iron from the metallic ones. We get sand from all kinds of places and stone from all kinds of places that we can turn into glass, and then the carbon comes straight out of the carbonic ones. Stir them up a little bit and we get the little white science packs out. So that was very, very easy. And producing the parts to make rockets wasn't much harder in and of itself. There wasn't too much more to do there. So that was also fairly straightforward. The bits that were specific to this planet and felt like really the core things we were meant to be doing on this planet were really quite quick. And if we'd imported enormous quantities of belts from Norvis, then we'd probably have got this planet up and running much more quickly than we did. So again, there wasn't a huge amount to do here. That said, once again, we found a few extra things to do. So since we left this planet, we've been able to start producing silicon from some of the ores processing we're doing, and bringing that over and making silicon wafers from that is another thing we can do on this planet. That said, I don't think we've really used the silicon wafers for very much yet. I'm sure we will, but so far they've not been used a great deal. We're also aware that there are going to be some more advanced science packs coming sooner or later on this planet that we haven't done yet, we haven't seen yet, but there's going to be at least one reason to come back here again. And then Igris was fairly straightforward. Yes, we had to mine up an enormous quantity of stone and then pass that through the factory, but then there were only a handful of different things that needed to be done. We needed to make bricks, we needed to make conductive bricks, we needed to make magic glass, we needed to make various types of circuits and whatnot and so forth. And then we were fairly quickly throwing together the science packs down here. Yes, there's been a few new processes, a few new types of resource and various different things that we've had to get together, but it hasn't taken us all that long to get the basic systems up and running. So again, it was a relatively small scale planet. I think the biggest thing on this planet was the Cermite production over here. That threw in a couple of interesting loops for us. Firstly, as it was a reminder of things spoiling to useful products for anyone who hadn't considered the hot metals properly or looked at wood on Vulcanus, and we were introduced to that with the Cermite spoiling to steel. And then, over on the other side, we had the Cermite, and that's where you make the raw Cermite from bricks and oil, and then this is the system that Marc made, where it sits in a box here for a little while it decays most of the way, and then when it gets down to about 5 seconds left, it gets quickly yoinked out of the chest and put into the machine to be processed a little bit further. Did it go in? Yes, there you go. So it went into this machine here to then be cooked a bit further, and then it can be passed out into here to then finish its decaying, and then in 3 and a bit minutes it'll then be put out onto the belt here, and we'll have some Cermite to play with. So that was very, very interesting, because that was something completely different, and it was something we've not seen before. And I had a comment on one of my recent videos talking about this, how a lot of the things on Igris were, yes, there were little bits of things that were fancy and different, like pulling copper out of nowhere, out of thin air. That was a little bit different, but sort of manageable, and in a way it's kind of like an offshore pump in that you're just producing resources from nowhere. The other intermediates were fairly standard. They were just, you take some inputs and you have some outputs, nothing that special. It was different, yes, different names, different pictures, a slightly different feel to it. There were some challenges from the numbers with the sheer amount of stone that goes in over here, and with it being a 300 to 50 and 50 rather than a 6 to 1 and 1 recipe, and I've talked about that before, but there were some differences in there, but it was fairly standard. And then over here, making the science packs in order to make the next science pack was, again, slightly different, but it was still a case of take some resources, make an intermediate, then make the next thing. So there was, again, not so much of a difference there. And even the magic crystal things, that was just, it was taking a fluid, you turn it into some outputs, you process the outputs and turn it into science packs. That was all, it's all fairly standard Factorio stuff. But the Cermite processing over here, this was completely different. So in the past, we've seen systems where you make something and you try and have it decay as quickly as possible, like the Cermite over here, where we wanted to turn it into steel. Or the hot metals, where the metal comes out of the furnaces at a high temperature, and then you need to wait for it to cool before you can actually use it. Those are both examples of wanting something to decay as quickly as possible, and not worrying about exactly how long it takes. Then there's so many other things where things go off gradually, and I think so far about the only one we found of those is raw fish, where if you hold it in your inventory, eventually it'll go off, and at that point it's useless. And so at that point, the puzzle is to try and keep things fresh for as long as possible. On Igris with the Cermite, on the other hand, it's neither of those. It's a third special, different kind of way of using it, where you want to let something decay as much as possible when it does its decaying quickly, where it only takes 2 minutes to spoil, and then pass it on, do the next step in order to maintain that freshness level, to pass it over to the thing that takes 5 hours to spoil, so it only has a couple of minutes of that left on the end. And so that is somewhere where Igris has done something very, very different. And we're very keen on that sort of thing because it's very interesting and we like seeing things that are interesting and use the mechanics of the game in a different way to offer us a new challenge. You might notice at this point that I've only actually talked about the modded planets, Lignumis, Maluna and Igris, because Norvis we did an enormous amount of stuff on. This has been built up to an enormous scale, as you can see here. There are many, many things happening on this planet, so this one has definitely not been a quick planet. We've spent huge amounts of time here, even as we've been buzzing off to other different planets. We've often been looking back at Norvis and then making improvements, putting in new city blocks to do new different things. And that's been quite interesting. It's kept things going, but it is the one planet, and Mike's comment is that it feels very much like you have your one central planet where everything happens, and then external exoplanets that just do a little bit of work and produce little bits of things here and there. Basically putting science packs together, and there haven't been all that many different steps to make the science packs. Lignumis, you need gold, which is just ore that grows in rocks and then is smelted, and then a bit of steam, which comes from wherever you want it to come from, and that's a very, very trivial science pack. It's early game, but still, it's a trivial science pack. The Maluna one, I've already talked about how trivial that is. Then there's the Igrian one, which is somewhat more complex, especially as it requires making purple science as one of the components. It somehow felt fairly simple to me, but I think that might have been because somebody else did it, or perhaps because we already knew about purple science from making it on Norvis. And the general system on the planet is relatively small when you compare it to Norvis, where there's enormous flows of everything going around all over the place. And now part of that is because Norvis has lots more science packs, so we've got lots of different ones, all the way up to the yellow science down here, which takes in quite a lot of different resources in various different forms. But then why couldn't some of the other science packs take in lots of different complicated resources like this in order to produce them? And maybe we'll see more of that in the future. We could still be on fairly early planets, but we'll have to wait and see how that goes. The other one I've skipped over is Vulcanus, and Tristan actually queried Mike on that one, saying, do you feel the same way about Vulcanus? Because with that being an actual vanilla planet, it's one that's been fully developed, has had all of the effort put in by Wubian, and is sort of therefore one of the gold standard of additional planets. And Mike had to admit that he did miss out on quite a lot of Vulcanus because he had to skip a couple of streams due to work or shenanigans or something like that. So he sort of feels the same way about it, except that he's aware that that might not be an entirely accurate feeling he's got there. And to be fair, on Vulcanus, now that we've got it up and running, making the science pack is still quite straightforward. All it is lava coming in, being processed with some calcite to make the molten copper here. Okay, you have to get rid of the stone, but that's all. And then the tungsten being brought in a couple of forms, and that is just the material for this planet, where we bring in the tungsten ore and smelt it into the plates. That does take some iron, molten iron as well. And then additionally we get the, I don't even know where we're making the tungsten triangles. It's up here. And that requires sulfuric acid and carbon, so there's a little bit more detail going into this one. But even so, it's still a fairly simple science pack as they go. And I remember thinking when I was playing Space Age that the Vulcanan one felt like the simplest of the sort of the later game ones, so the sort of the semi-exotic ones. So all of the exoplanets, and also probably simpler than purple and yellow science pack on Norvis. So this is quite an easy science pack to make. However, Vulcanus has a lot of other toys available. So we've got all of the big mining drills and the big crushers and the foundries and the green belts, and there's probably other things that I've missed as well. So there's lots of other new exciting things that are made because you come to Vulcanus, and those are things that you're going to want elsewhere around the solar system. And so that is part of the reason that Vulcanus is probably our second most developed planet, by which I mean it's got the second most amount of stuff on it, and is probably going to be producing the second most amount of stuff after Norvis. So this has grown to be quite a significant undertaking, I feel, and we're producing a lot of resources on this planet, and then they're being shipped off, and they're being incredibly useful elsewhere. And continuing with Mike's comments, he said that because we're getting through the exoplanets fairly quickly, it means that people don't generally get the chance to get their teeth fully into a planet, because if you're messing around somewhere else, or you end up doing a couple of the simpler jobs on a planet, then by the time you get back and you start working on it again, then most of the things have been finished. And yeah, sure, there's going to be some tidying up and some expansion to do, but you never really got to sink your teeth into thinking about the exact weirdnesses of that planet and trying to get your head around it. And as I say, I think Igris is probably quite a good example, because this isn't meant to be an early game planet. This is meant to be the same sort of tier as Vulcanus, but it does feel like it's quite a lot simpler. Okay, there are a couple of toys that are going to be coming in from here. We're going to get the Science Enhancer machines being shipped out in quantity, and we're also making the diagonal inserters up here. And so those are a couple of things we're going to be wanting to use on all the planets in the future, but then there's not as much stuff, and the stuff doesn't feel as important as the things that are being pulled out from Vulcanus. Marc's opinions, however, are sort of almost the other way round. He said he's found it quite nice that we've had a nice combination of the big vanilla planets, so Norvis and Vulcanus so far, and then probably Gleba and Fulgora and eventually Aquilo as well. They're presumably all going to be fairly big, combined with slightly smaller modded planets. And I think the modded planets are naturally going to be a little bit smaller because they've been made by people as a hobby in their spare time, and they've not had as much time to devote to them. Now, some of them are really nice and polished. I feel that Lignumis is an excellent example that brings in lots of new ideas, like the whole noise pollution system, and being able to grow gold on the planet, and having another new resource, and putting a bit more emphasis on wood, and having the peat there. And yeah, there's lots of new designs in here, and everything comes together quite nicely and quite neatly. It's even got its own music. Maluna, on the other hand, feels like it's perhaps taking some of the resource gathering that you would otherwise have done in space and moving that onto a planet. Now, sure, it's got its own new little things as well, like it's got the silicon supply. There's that extra science pack that I alluded to earlier that we haven't got to yet, and we're going to find out more about in the future. And there's a wood processing system on here as well that we would have needed to do even if we hadn't gone to Lignumis first. So there are some new things on this planet, but overall it feels to me like it's a lot of the stuff that was originally done in space and has been moved onto a planet and then expanded a bit. Igris is new and weird and completely different, and I'm really enjoying that, but it is, as I said, still relatively small. Marc is really looking forward to having a play with Gleba because he finds the spoilage mechanic very interesting, especially now that he's whetted his appetite with a bit of investigation of spoilage over on Igris. That's going to give him a bit of an insight into the sort of things that are going to be required on Gleba, although, as you may or may not be aware at this point, in a slightly different way. So Gleba is still going to be its own mystery and its own fun and its own excitement when we get out there. It remains to be seen, of course, how big all of the other planets we go out to are. So far we have a sample size of 3 modded planets, and they've all been relatively small compared to the other ones. We'll next be going off to Cubium and investigating that one, so we'll see what that involves. And then we've got, well, there's quite a lot more. As I've said a number of times, we do have 20 planets to go to, and so far we've been to 5 of them. So there is a lot of this game left. We're maybe a quarter of the way in by number of planets, and I wouldn't be surprised if by the time we start getting close to the edge, we discover some more planets that we can add in as well. Safir's feelings appear to be a kind of combination of the other two. He's enjoying the mix of seeing the vanilla planets and then the little modded ones that come along as well, but he does agree that some of them feel a little bit short in comparison, particularly Igris. And I think the part of the reason that Igris is the one that we're focusing on there is perhaps because Lignumis felt very much like a starter planet, and as did Maluna in a sort of way because it was a moon of Norvis. You feel like it's part of the same general system. Although he does bring up a very good point that is, it's going to be interesting when we end up going back to planets. And as I've said, we've been back to Lignumis to turn the steam science production back on again and start shipping that out. We've actually gone back to Maluna, although we'll talk about that a lot more in the future, but that was mostly because we had a mod update which broke lots of things there. And we are continually going back to Vulcanus because we want the toys from it, although that's slightly different. We haven't needed to necessarily build that one up any further. And of course, Norvis is forever getting bigger and bigger as well. And this was a thing in vanilla as well, where each time you completed a new planet, and by completed I mean you got its resources up and running and you got its toys available, then you could go back to all of the planets you've been to beforehand and do some upgrades on them. And I think that's going to be a big part of the game as we carry on. We're going to unlock new toys, we're going to go off and play with them, and we're going to want to then upgrade all of the previous planets. And we're going to be fighting between the urge to go off and do upgrades and go off and make them faster, more efficient, stronger, better, just generally improve them, versus going off to the new planets to see all the exciting new shiny stuff that's going to be brought in by all the different mods we've got to play with. And I think those two are going to be a very interesting sort of push and pull as we carry on with the game. And I've certainly been feeling that a bit as we've gone on so far. Marc is definitely very much a go back and upgrade the planets with the new toys we've acquired person. I'm very much a, oh, I want to see the new shiny thing, let's go off and play with that. And so I'm not going to say we've argued about it, but there's definitely been a bit of sort of gentle disagreement in there, shall we say. Safir is also definitely very interested in going back and doing upgrades and restructuring, and perhaps fixing things that were broken, perhaps because we didn't have the capability to build them the way we wanted to, or perhaps just because they've decayed and they've had issues over time and through sort of bit rot and just things gradually decaying, falling apart, and unexpected mistakes being found. He's hoping to see lots of planets requiring significant big rebuilds, which may well end up being passed off to other people as we start going off to other planets as well. And that can kind of work with the system we're using. So for example, the next thing that's going to happen is I'm going to head off to Cubium, and I'm probably going to require a stream over there to get my thoughts together and look at the lay of the land and make sure I understand how things work before I want to pull all the others in to help me start the building. And now I don't want to get too much building work done before they arrive, because we've decided that we do want to stick together, especially for the initial exciting discovery phase of a planet. However, that time while I'm thinking about it and doing a bit of research is the perfect opportunity to perhaps expand on Lignumis and start making more blue circuits, or go over to Maluna and fix up the problems that have been created by the mod upgrades, or just go back to Norvis with all of the foundries from Vulcanus and maybe some of the higher tech stuff from Igris, although technically we shouldn't just yet, and do some upgrades over there. So there's always room for expansion and always things that need to be worked on. Tristan has commented that he's also been generally quite happy with all the planets. There's been similarities between them, sure, but none of them have felt too similar to the point where you go, well, what's the point in doing this planet? We've already done this on such and such another planet. He has noticed, though, regarding some of the size comments Mike was making earlier, that perhaps the reason that some of the planets seem a bit too small is because we have 5 players, and so that means if we go into a planet that theoretically takes 15 hours, we can get it done in one stream if we play efficiently and spread the tasks nicely between us. And so that means that a planet has to really be quite big for it to take us a significant amount of time to sort it out and get it moved on. Either that, or we just have to play quite inefficiently, which, well, maybe we do sometimes. And this sort of comes back to the standard problem about how many people we should have on each planet. So maybe Igris would have been done just as easily with 2 or 3 people on it, and we wouldn't have been getting in each other's way. Maluna, well, we only had 1 or 2 or eventually 3 people on it, and that got done reasonably quickly, but it meant some people felt left out. Vulcanus, I think we had all of us on there, and it went quite smoothly, although that was a bigger planet. But it does come down to the balance between making sure we don't get in each other's way on a planet, but then also that we don't miss out on things that are going on, because all the planets are interesting and exciting. I think my feelings are probably similar to Marc's. I've definitely enjoyed having the variety we're seeing on the exoplanet and coming across new and weird processes that we need to deal with, whether that's going out and hunting the demolishers on Vulcanus, or putting in the systems based around the foundries and the lava processing. I do like how how everything suddenly becomes free on Vulcanus, because you can pull the lava straight out of the lakes, and suddenly iron and copper are about as difficult to get as water is over on Norvis. That's been lovely, and there's so much you can do with that to make enormous quantities of stuff. But even though making all of that stuff on Vulcanus is basically free, that doesn't mean that it's free everywhere around the solar system, because you still have to pay for all the rocket launches, which means enormous quantities of blue circuits, low density structures and rocket fuel. And the blue circuits in particular are a bit of an effort to make on this planet, and actually the rocket fuel as well. Those are made out of resources that aren't free. So if you think, well, okay, we're making enormous quantities of metals on this planet, why don't we just start shipping off the iron to Igris, because that doesn't have any? You then quickly start running into the issue of costs of logistics. And so that means that while something is free on this planet, it doesn't mean it's necessarily free elsewhere. And that puts an interesting sort of balance on keeping on making things on different planets. And it's something that certainly in the late game, space exploration didn't really have, because logistics got so cheap. I have been amused by the sheer different numbers of ways there are to make plastic in this mod pack. So you've got the Malunan recipe, where you crush wood and turn it into cellulose, and then turn that into petroleum gas eventually, and so on and so on, and then you can turn that petroleum gas into plastic in almost the normal way, except again using more cellulose. Then you've got the Lignumian system, where you're using a type of bacteria that you feed on wood pulp and water, and then that grows more of the bacteria, and then that can somehow be turned into plastic. And there are lots and lots of other different recipes as well for plastic. And at first I thought, that's a bit weird, I don't like that. That's just sort of, each planet is just coming up with its own way to do something that relies on the resources you get on that planet. But then I thought about it a little bit differently, and of course plastic is basically just strings of hydrocarbons, and so of course there's going to be lots of different ways to make that. Anything that allows you to get basically hydrogen and carbon together is going to be a way to make plastic. There are lots of sort of organic chemistry ways to make plastic, and so why shouldn't each planet have its own slightly different twist on them? And so after thinking about it that way, that made a lot more sense. And so with that, I feel like that does come together quite nicely, and so some of the varieties of recipes do feel like they work together quite well, and I like seeing the different approaches and then having a different system that you need to work on each different planet you go to. My next question for the guys was, what do you think about the new toys and the new techs we've discovered and unlocked as we've been working through the game? And Safir has really enjoyed having done Vulcanus because of this, because Vulcanus makes a lot of exciting toys. So we've got the big crushers, the big drills and the foundries, and all of those are fantastically useful on other planets because you get these massive productivity bonuses from them. So we get a plus 50% base productivity from using the big crushers, and there's a 50% resource drain from using the big mining drills, and another 50% base productivity from using the foundries. So running through these three devices, if you use a big drill and then a big crusher and then a foundry, you're going to get 4.5 times as much of the resource out as if you just use a normal drill and basic crusher and a normal smelter. So there's an enormous improvement available from using these toys, and so that's why Vulcanus has ended up being built up quite so much with quite so many rocket silos here, because then you can send out all of these fantastically useful buildings to everywhere else around the solar system that's going to be using them. And so this is probably going to make a lot of the other planets we land on functionally somewhat easier, because we'll be able to get those significant boosts on a lot of the things we're producing. Essentially, any time we dig metal out of the ground and then process it into a plate form of some form or another, then we're going to be able to use all of this. However, in order to use the foundries, you do need to bring in the calcite. So that's going to be another steady drain on Vulcanus, and we're going to be needing to provide a steady stream of calcite from here to go off to all the other planets that are using the foundries. And so that means Vulcanus is going to carry on being useful for a very, very long time like that. There's also the green belts down here, the next stage of belt speed up after the yellow, red, blue and green. Oh, and brown of course as well. And that's another example of where the toys from Vulcanus are going to be extremely useful in the future. I've also noticed that this belt is the wrong way around. Let's fix that. There we go. I don't know how these things get themselves turned around like this all the time. I really don't. Oh, and of course there's the cliff explosives, and that's a Vulcanan tech, so you require the Vulcanan science packs in order to make that. But once you've got that, as long as you've got a supply of calcite, you can then make those on other planets. So we don't have to ship them from here, but we did need to do a research based on this planet. He also, as an aside, mentions the recycling technology over here. I think this is what he's referring to, where we're bringing in any of the spare stone that's produced by the factory, because whenever you turn lava into metals, you have an output of stone, like this. There's a belt piece missing there, and so that then flows around here and then goes up into this system, where it then gets recycled in a slightly weird way into all kinds of useful things on the other side. Well, some useful things, some not so useful things, and then we can then reprocess these and get a lot more stuff coming out of the factory. So in theory, if we get through enough of the basic metals, we may at that point stop needing to dig up quite so much of the tungsten from the patches over here, and it would be very, very interesting to find out if we can get a factory that is completely self-supplied by the stone that comes out of making the metals. And in order to get that, we might need a slightly larger supply of metals being used, but if we do get to that point, that could be quite interesting and would put a slightly different twist on the way the factories work. He's also said that he's looking forward to seeing the Igrian stuff being used, so that's the science enhancement machines. For these ones, it's not just the machines, you also need to ship out large quantities of the magic fluid, because that can only be mined on this planet. And so we've got rockets here that are taking it away, and at the moment that's being dropped off on Norvis, being brought down here and then passed over to a station over here, and eventually we'll start using that for science. We haven't yet, because we haven't really got enough of it to feel stable, but each one of these fluids will allow one of those science enhancement machines to run once. So there's enough in these tanks for the science enhancement machines to run 62,000 times, and because that means they then produce 2.5 times as much science as they normally would, that's going to give us somewhere in the region of 90,000 free science packs. And that's quite a lot, especially if we sort of try to be fairly careful about how we use it and make sure we use it for the more expensive and more difficult science packs. And I think I agree with that. It's been interesting seeing all of the different additional machines, and Lignumis has its own sort of thing along those lines. For anything wood-based, you can make in a lumber mill and you get a 50% productivity, and it's a slightly faster machine as well. So it's continuing the theme of the exoplanets, giving you something that works with things themed to that planet, and gives you a 50% productivity bonus. And so that's quite nice. And then I agree entirely with Safir on having all the toys coming in from Vulcanus and being able to use the foundries elsewhere around the solar system. They are very, very nice. Tristan has commented that whilst it's something that hasn't actually happened yet, it would be a big shame if we discovered a new technology and then the next planet immediately made it redundant. So for example, if we had the big mining drills from Vulcanus and then we'd gone off to Igris and discovered that Igris has an even better drill and therefore we wouldn't want to use the big mining drills, we'd just be immediately replacing them with something else because it's a lot more effective. And this is in a way a risk of playing a game where we've just thrown a load of extra planet mods together rather than one that has been designed carefully for where all the mods work together very nicely. There is certainly a risk that we'll find that two mod authors have had very, very similar ideas and maybe implemented more or less the same thing in slightly different ways, or where one is objectively slightly better than the other, and therefore there's no point in using the slightly worse one. And yes, it would be a shame if we discovered this. So far, everything has been suitably different. We've got multiple ways of making blue circuits, and we're trying to decide which of those is the best and most efficient way, whether we're better off doing them on Lignumis or in the standard traditional way on Norvis. Maluna is its own thing. It's not really exporting anything particularly different and weird and new. Vulcanus has its more powerful machines for doing metallurgy. Igris is all about the magical science production. But there is certainly a risk that maybe Rubia or Tiber or Meraxis will come with some other science production system that will make the one we got on Igris somewhat redundant. Or possibly even worse than that, we might discover that one of those planets has a science thing that is worse than Igris's, and therefore we wouldn't even want to use it in the first place, and that would be even more of a shame. But we're just going to have to see what happens as we get further into the game. Tristan has commented that it would be worth having a look at the various technologies we've discovered in the research tree, and making sure that we're aware that they all exist, and that we haven't sort of sneakily researched something that people haven't noticed. And so I think that means it'd be a good point now to have a look through all the researches that we've done recently and make sure everybody is aware of them all. We have done an enormous amount of productivity research. We've done mining productivity from 3 up to 14, and that has boosted our mining productivity level up to 140%. So that means every time a drill runs, we get almost 2.5 pieces of ore out, whilst only removing 1 from that patch. When you then couple that with the big mining drills that double the amount of you get out of a patch as well, we're getting absolutely crazy amounts out, even from relatively small patches, so that's amazing. We've done steel plate productivity 1 to 7, and again that's another thing that gets you just bonuses whenever you try and make one of these things. So any time a steel plate is made anywhere, or at least if it's made in a smelter or in a foundry, we will get an additional 60% of a steel plate produced from that as well. Now, I don't think this covers Cermet going off, but it does cover any normal production of steel. Similarly, low density structure productivity all the way up to level 8, which for some reason only seems to give us a 60% boost, but never mind, that's still quite a lot, and low density structures are quite expensive, so having a bonus in there is very, very nice. We've done copper plate productivities 1 to 4, so that's brought our productivity up to 40%, nice and easy there. And this is an Igrian technology. This is one of the things we get from being on a planet that has lots and lots of copper in the atmosphere. Apparently we can then do research to find out how to get more out of our copper production, so that's really nice. And we've got some bonuses to glass productivity. Now this is specifically the Igrius magic glass productivity, so we're now getting plus 50% on that one. So every time we make a piece of magic glass we get another half free, and that's really good because we were struggling quite a lot with the throughput of the magic glass over here. We had these 3 belts of stone pouring in, and the magic glass was pouring out at such a rate that we just couldn't keep up. And now at this point it seems like it's jammed up again, so I'm going to have an investigate about that. That shouldn't happen, but even with half of the production being jammed, we are still producing enough magic glass that the system is being kept at least reasonably happy, if not quite as happy as I would like it to be. We've done laser weapon damage from 7 up to 11, so that means we're now getting a nice shiny plus 510% damage out of all of our laser weapons. And that's really nice because we are using quite a lot of laser weapons, especially over on Norvis, where they're providing the main bulk of our defensive abilities over here. So we're getting lots and lots of damage out of those, so that's really very much appreciated. And also our PLDs as well, so they're nice and powerful. And similarly, we've taken physical projectile damage from 7 to 11, so once again that's giving us a nice healthy bonus of 180% on our bullet damage. We've taken artillery shell damage from level 1 to level 4, which is giving us a plus 40% boost on the amount of damage done. I don't know if that's enough to actually take out most of the biter stuff with a single shot, but it's a step in the right direction. Next on the list was a whole host of Igrian sciences that we did basically by landing on the planet. So we learnt what we can do with conductive bricks by making some, and that allows us to make magic pump jacks and rail from conductive bricks. So great, did that. And then with those magic pump jacks, we dug up some magic fluid, and that taught us about magic fluid processing. And we processed some of that, we got 10 crystals, and we learned about how to turn them into enhanced crystals, or the rich crystals rather, and how to make magic tesseracts out of them. And once we made a magic tesseract, we were then able to start making the Igrian science packs. And it apparently took us slightly closer to discovering nanofoamed polymers, which is something we don't know about yet, but we'll find out about that later, I'm sure. And then once we've made some of the mineral science, we were able to spend that on Igris itself. So we were using local science labs out over there in order to make a glass space rocket silo and a glass space rocket part. And this then allows us to make rockets on Igris and start shipping the science pack back over to Norvis, where they can be used for all kinds of exciting stuff. These included making the rich magic tesseracts, which then led on quickly to making science enrichment buildings, and these are fantastic. So we then, this meant that even though we'd already made the mineral science pack systems, we then had to rip them out and replace them with the better ones, but you know what, it was totally worth it. And then the strong barrels, which allow us to then transport the magic fluid over to Norvis. And apparently this also gets us Spidertrons, because that's hidden behind mineral science packs these days, and you need rich magic tesseracts in order to make a Spidertron. So we can now actually make those guys and have them skitter around on various planets. I don't know how much we're going to use them, but we are now able to make them if we want to. And finally, with the Igrian stuff, we're also able to make the diagonal inserters. I talked about these a little bit. They are exactly what the name suggests. They're going to be fun to play with, and they're going to allow us to make our spaghetti even more spaghetti. So that's always fun. And at this point, I think this is a good time to end the video. So I hope you found it interesting, and it's been a lovely insight into the way our warped minds work. If you want to see more of how our minds work, or don't work as the case may be, then come and join us every Monday evening at 7:30 PM UK time, when we'll be streaming some more Planetary Pioneers. And if you fancy giving this mod pack a try for yourself, then you can grab the Planetary Pioneers mod from the Factorio mod portal as well, and stick in the seed 11111 if you want to play in the same universe as us. On Wednesday evenings at 8 PM I shall be playing some more Foundry. I'm building up my factory bigger and bigger and making more and more types of robots, and I'm really enjoying that and really looking forward to when the train beta comes out fairly soon. These videos will be coming out every Thursday and Friday as well, so please make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on any of that. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.